This is SoundNotion, the weekly podcast for new music and music news. I'm Patrick Gulo.
I'm Sam Merciers.
I'm Dave McDonald.
And I'm Nate Blyton.
And joining us this week is Alex Ross, noted author of The Rest is Noise and Listen to This, which just came out in paperback. He's also the music critic for The New Yorker. And pretty much if you don't know who he is, you probably live under a rock. Alex, thanks for joining us this week.
Sure, great to be here. I feel like I've made the big time now.
You flatter us.
We feel like we've made the big time.
Exactly.
I said when we started the show back in January, like, if we can ever get Alex Ross on the show, then we know we'll have made something pretty cool.
Well, here I am.
Yeah. Well, we're glad you could join us.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I think it's really great we have you on this week is the paperback edition of your most recent book, Listen to This, just came out. So maybe we could start off with you just kind of telling us a little bit about that book and what you've been up to lately. Oh, there it is. There, show us again.
We have a new cover for the paperback.
Yeah.
Nice.
To create the illusion of novelty.
Sold at fine bookstores everywhere.
Pretty much, yeah.
So
sorry.
Can you tell us about it?
Yeah.
For those in the audience that may not have picked it up yet?
Yeah, this is a book that came out last year in hardback, a collection of my essays from The New Yorker going back to 1994, actually even before I was the staff music critic there. And I did rewrite some of the essays and added one long, completely new piece that had never appeared anywhere to give people a little more bang for their buck if they'd already read some of the pieces in The New Yorker. And, in the wake of The Rest is Noise, I de-emphasized the 20th century somewhat, which, I had been obsessed with for so long. So I actually avoided did not include a series of essays that I'd written for The New Yorker on Strauss, Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Shostakovich, and so on. And so it sort of tilts back somewhat in time. They're essays on the canonical composers, and I also really wanted to make an effort to bring in all of my scattered writings on pop music and weave the classical and the pop, not particularly popular musicians in some cases, weave them together and sort of see what results in the way of a wide-ranging narrative of music at the present moment. And I was also trying for maximum geographical diversity, so I'm traveling around a lot in these articles, Alaska, China, South America, as well as the obvious Europe and North America. And I've always felt that music can really be a way of experiencing the world, whether or not you ever travel to the places where composers and musicians come from. So that's maybe the guiding theme behind the entire book. But really, I just thought, see what would happen if I combined all these pieces together.
Yeah.
Do you imagine the audience for this newest book to be like the educated, a musically educated audience, or is it more for like a lay audience?
Well, both, hopefully. I mean, the assignment that I've always had at The New Yorker is to write for the generally bright, educated people who subscribe to the magazine. Some of them will know a great deal about classical music, and some of them will know next to nothing. And so the challenge has always been to write in a way that catches the interest of both of those groups. And so I always feel as I'm sort of zigzagging back and forth between a slightly more technical point and then a sentence or a paragraph by way of very basic introduction, even for the most famous composers of the canon. And so this book and The Rest is Noise are really designed for a similar kind of audience. Although in the end, all I can do is put words down on paper that just seem to satisfy me and sort of meet whatever standard I'm trying to set for myself. I often think I'm writing for myself aged 18 or something, the sort of, skeptical, the once very skeptical guy who actually didn't care very much about journalism. I didn't read much music criticism at that time. So, it's, I think anyone who writes or composes or works in any field, you can't spend too much time thinking about your audience, or you get lost in a sort of a very speculative game. But obviously, what really matters to me, if someone comes up to me when I do a reading or whatever and says, I had actually never heard of Messiaen until you wrote about the Quartet for the End of Time in the New Yorker, and I was intrigued, and I went and got a recording, and then I went to see the piece live, and now I'm obsessed by Messiaen and never miss a performance of his music, and that certainly means more to me than anything to reach out to that kind of reader. It makes me think that I'm doing something more than just being a functional critic, but that I also might be playing a role in the bigger community of music, a sort of a socially constructive role to some extent.
Yeah. That actually kind of reminds me of something that I've always really admired about your writing, is that you manage to describe the music that you're writing about in a way that is both precise and says something very specific that I can understand, something about a piece of music that I may not have heard before, but is still kind of poetic and gives something of kind of more emotional or a little bit less concrete about it. And I've always admired how you have that balance between those two things, because I feel like a lot of music writing is this really like wishy-washy, it doesn't really tell me very much about the piece of music that the person's writing about. How do you get to that point?
Well, I mean, one thing I very often do is to pair a technical term with a metaphor, a sort of slightly more poetic turn of phrase by way of explaining what it means to someone who doesn't know the technical term. Sneering glissando on the trombones, it would be an obvious kind of example. So the term itself, and then some sense of its effect and significance. And so on various levels, I'm always doing that kind of jockeying back and forth between the technical language and the illustrative, the metaphorical language. And I always like to try to do that without being too obvious about it, because when a critic says, well, as you may not know, the glissando means, that's irritating to the reader. So I try to sort of slip it in without calling a great deal of attention to that kind of explanatory language, and hopefully it can sort of serve two purposes at once, to accomplish the explanation, but also, even for someone who knows perfectly well what these terms mean, to give a little moment of, it is a bit of a sneer, isn't it? But this is a very basic example. But
where does this accent come from?
It's like I can hear the coattails flapping.
He's going Madonna on us.
Yes, well, no, thanks so much. I mean, it really means a lot when expert people such as yourselves are also.
Alex Ross calls the SoundNotion crew experts.
That's a pull quote now.
So, Alex, I agree with Dave that, I'm probably one of the most vocal complainants about superfluous, meaningless, metaphorical garbage that people write and call music criticism. And I think that you strike a fine line, and I think without question you're probably helped in that capacity by having some formal music training. I hear on your Wikipedia entry it says you studied composition.
It also says in his book, Sam.
And well, I can't pull his book up by typing his name into Google. And also, I watched an interview with you on Charlie Rose, which congratulations, getting on Charlie Rose is pretty awesome. In 2008, talking about The Rest Is Noise, and you said that you envied composers and that you wanted to be a composer. I wonder if you have anything to say about how that has affected you as a music critic, and whether having some of those formal skills and an actual desire to create music gives you a leg up, so to speak, over music critics that don't have that kind of a background.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of music critics out there, most critics actually, have had some form or another of serious musical training. And I know everyone likes to run critics down. Oh, they can't really play the piano as well as Yevgeny Kissin. How can they know what they're talking about? But many of them are seriously trained. Tony Tomasini, the head critic of the New York Times, has a doctorate of all things. So that's pretty impressive. But my training was a bit more irregular. I mean, I didn't end up going to music school. I studied piano from a pretty early age and took composition lessons from several people. Denning Barnes, who was my piano teacher and sort of composition teacher, Russell Woolen a little later. And then when I got to college, I took this class with Peter Lieberson, which it wasn't really a composition class per se, but it was a sort of harmony, second year harmony class that had a lot of composition exercises involved in it, and it felt more like a composing class. And I mean, having attempted to be a composer is totally at the core of my work as a critic, and I would not be interested in being a critic if I didn't have the opportunity to talk a lot about contemporary music and the 20th century tradition. Not that I don't care about the older music, but it just means so much more to me as a journalist to begin with, to report on the news, and new music really is the biggest news you can find in this world. And I always feel as though I'm looking at things from the composer's point of view, and whether it's older music or contemporary music, and I know how hard it is. I mean, my experience trying to be a composer was very frustrating, because I didn't have a complete lack of talent, but I just had so much trouble getting past the starting point. I mean, I would just constantly be beginning pieces and coming up with sort of 15 bars of a string quartet or 20 bars of a violin sonata, and then I just couldn't quite decide on what was going to happen next, and I just lacked that ability to imagine the whole landscape of a 15, 20-minute, never mind, hour-long piece in my head. And it is such a huge leap of faith and an act of courage to sort of dare to put notes down on paper, and I think, and so I just feel that that composition is a heroic profession, and I do what I can to support it in my writing.
It's interesting because your writing can be really quite expansive.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's some sort of flaw in my brain, I guess, that with writing, it just always came so much more naturally. And from an early age, I was writing papers that were unnecessarily irritatingly long, and 70-page history papers for my for my high school classes and this kind of thing. And I just had a lot to say, but also I never had trouble with the big picture. Although that said, when it came to writing a book, there were many moments where I felt seriously at sea working on The Rest Is Noise, because I was very used to this sort of 5,000, 8,000 word format, and I just felt I was losing my mind at many points, because I couldn't see the whole thing as I was working on the book. It always felt as though I was sort of lost in the middle. But I did sort of work my way to the end of it after a number of years. But that was a scary exercise. But yeah, for whatever reason, just writing always came much easier to me.
Yeah, I can imagine the rest is noise feeling like quite an undertaking. It's a really great book. And one of the ways that I knew that it was for serious and going to be around for a while was I remember, I had read the book and I was going to the university bookstore a couple of semesters later to pick up my books, and for one of the classes it was on the required reading stack, and there was a stack of like 20 of them there.
I had it as
like,
required reading in one of my classes.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, well, that scares me a little bit. And I hadn't really been thinking of it as a textbook, while I was working on it, but as a supplement to.
It was a really hip class that I was in. So.
But no, I'm so amazed by what happened with that book, because my chief aim when it came out was for it not to be a total disaster, and
sounds like when we're starting
you
a
set
composition.
a high bar for yourself.
Well, no, I mean, because so many things come out and are ignored, and so I just thought, if only it can sort of be a very modest success to Steam, and sell a few copies, so maybe they'll let me write another one someday. I didn't want it to be a complete embarrassment to the publisher, and so everything beyond that was an astonishment. I mean, of course, I fantasized about it doing well, but I couldn't seriously expect it, because publishing is a very hazardous game, and so to have it take off to some extent in America, and even more frankly in England. It was just kind of an amazing phenomenon over there, and in Spain, it was kind of a bestseller in Spain, which was amazing to me, and so I'm really grateful for this, and I put my work into it and did everything I could to make it work, but I just feel lucky, that this happened to work for me in this way.
I feel like one of the reasons that it probably took off was how personal you made these connections. How personally you made these connections with these musicians and composers of the last 100 years or so, and it's kind of. We talked kind of earlier about the balance that you strike between being precise and poetic in your writing, and I also think you strike a nice balance between showing a lot of respect and admiration for these musicians and composers, but not beatifying them, and really treating them like people. And I feel for that reason, it's a great introduction to people who are for whom this music is completely outside their experience. And in a lot of ways, I think it says that this music is really not that different from the music that you may be familiar with, and that these guys are not crazy hermits, and they're not these demigods. They're just people that are trying to do interesting things.
Oh yeah, I mean, that was really, really important to the whole conception of the book from the beginning. And I've always been, from the moment I started out, deeply influenced by Richard Cheruskin, who's obviously a controversial figure in many circles, but and I certainly don't agree with him all the time, but his approach, the deep seriousness with which he goes about talking about these questions of composers in society, composers as flesh and blood figures on a very complicated human stage has mattered a lot. And something he always says is, no fairy tales. Let's put aside all the fairy tales. So I tried to write a book about modern music without the fairy tales, and just trying to grasp as best I could the very complicated and agonizing reality of the situation. And you mentioned that it feels like a very personal book, which it was, even though from after the prologue, the introduction, I actually never used the first person once, all the way through the book, and I sort of made a point of that, because it was actually already personal enough that I didn't need to sort of bring myself into the picture. And yeah, I felt all this very deeply. You know, what these composers went through, the sort of the political situations, and just the strange agony of being a composer at all in the 20th century, with this sort of rising tide of distractions and competing cultural forms, and the sense of loss, you know, this enormous sense of loss from the apparent golden age of the 19th century, when you know, composers were these colossi sort of striding across the earth, and so that is something sort of each generation of composers has struggled with and really worked through, and found their audiences nonetheless, even if it seems diminished in comparison.
Yeah.
That sort of suggests a question that I was wondering about. Having now 2 well-received books, do you feel like a weight of responsibility? Sort of like you've got the people now, so now you can start saying anything you want, and they're going to take you at your word. Do you
Right.
feel like it's had some sort of effect on you, and do you think about what you're going to write differently after having 2 books and knowing that your name is so much more synonymous with understanding classical music and modern music?
Yeah, well, I don't know about synonymous. But no, I mean, with, you know, especially after the Restless Noise came out, I just was, you know, better known as a writer, as an author in America, and then, you know, elsewhere in the world. And it actually weirded me out to some extent, because I'm a journalist, I'm a critic, and my sort of my natural attitude is to sit back and observe anonymously, sort of somewhere in the audience, or sort of at the back of a room when I'm sort of working on a reported story. And so becoming a little bit of a thing that sort of people were looking at and being interviewed and everything else was strange, and I still find it strange, and I really prefer to sort of slip back into that role of the anonymous observer. And, you know, this idea of having influence is something that I've always struggled with. I mean, when I was at the New York Times, you know, absolutely not because of what I was doing at the time in my writing, but just by virtue of the fact of being printed in the New York Times. There was an automatic influence. There was a sort of an echo chamber around what I was writing, which I really did struggle with, and was much more comfortable when I was then at the New Yorker and being a kind of a commentator, sort of second or third commentator, following in the wake of the critics of the Times, who remain the sort of critics of record, and so I do prefer that role. So I mean, obviously I like being read and you know, having an audience, but the question of having, you know, influence and impact always sort of starts to make me it's just strange to think about, and I prefer not to think about it as much as possible, and to sort of go on and just do what I do, and be alert to the new voices and events that I need to be paying attention to.
That actually brings up one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, you know, after getting all this attention for The Rest is Noise, and then listen to this, and probably now, since those books, more attention for your writings in The New Yorker, what do you feel is your role as a critic? How do you feel you contribute to the musical community and the culture at large?
Is it fundamentally different now than, say, maybe it used to be, for instance?
I don't think so. I mean, you're only as good as your last story. So I just always feel the pressure to keep coming up with strong and fresh ideas for stories, and then to try to do a good job of executing them. And that's what, you know, there are a lot of critics out there who are doing wonderful work and are especially energetic about covering contemporary composers or musicians who may not have the major label deal and sort of the sort of big time classical music advantage for whatever that's worth, who are sort of more to the margins, and that's certainly, that feels like a very big part of my job. And the great thing about being at the New Yorker, and I have to mention how much I owe to the New Yorker in terms of having gotten to this position wherever I am, is the freedom that they give me. And if I just don't feel like writing about Long at Carnegie Hall, I can ignore it and I can go off to Tulsa and write about the opera there. And so this sense of being able to create my own narrative or sort of fashion my own path through this very complicated and diverse musical world is so important to me. So I just want to carry on with that as long as I can.
I think that's one of the, to me, really interesting things about your writing, and I think for all of us, having gone to school in the Midwest and for the most part growing up in the Midwest, or not New York City and LA and San Francisco, is that you really do spend a good deal of time and care talking about these other places that still have really good, talented musicians, and there are still great performances going on in St. Louis and Kansas City and in Nashville, and that I feel like those don't often get any attention, even in local press. Those great performances. I've been reading your blog the last few weeks. You've been talking about a swing through the center of the U.S. and going through Kansas and Oklahoma and all of those very seemingly forgotten places by the arts anyway. And then you're in Listen to This, you talk about traveling with the St. Lawrence Quartet through a lot of those less less seemingly less cosmopolitan places.
Yeah, we went to Joplin actually. I was so distraught to see the catastrophe there, the tornado. We were there, and El Paso as well. I mean, it's sort of something that's come to the fore a little more recently. It wasn't something that I thought a lot about when I first started writing for the New Yorker in 1996, and then I was very keen to talk about the major New York institutions and go to Salzburg and Bayreuth and all these places. And more recently, I've been trying to focus more on American music and the breadth of American music all across the country. And I'm not quite sure what brought this on. I think it was just curiosity. I think the internet had a lot to do with it, just being able to sort of dial up at a moment's notice and see what the Alabama Symphony is doing this week, and see they're doing a piece by Paul Lansky. Wow, that's interesting, and thinking how is this going over with the audiences there, and sort of how are they playing? And I think I was really the internet made me more and more curious about sort of all of these organizations, big and small, and so I started fashioning these occasional trips to check it all out, and so I went on this sort of orchestra road trip in 2007, and then I just did this operatic expedition, and I went on the road with St. Lawrence Quartet, and hopefully we'll be able to do more of this in years to come. And I love driving long distances. It's just kind of a personal thing with me, and so and I like sort of just going to new places, and I think that dovetails nicely with my sort of what should be a sort of a basic aspect of a music critic's job, to travel to places. I mean, I know most critics don't have the budget to do this, and again, I'm just very lucky to have a travel budget and be able to go out on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
you know, there's so few critics now with that sort of, you know, national frame of reference, because we don't have a classical critic at you know, Time magazine and Newsweek and all these other national publications. I mean, I'm one of very, very few now writing regularly about classical music in a national magazine.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of I read a lot of a great journalism professor, Jeff Jarvis, and he writes a lot about the kind of future of journalism and the future of newspapers. And whenever he writes these things, it always seems to parallel, interestingly, the future of American symphony orchestras. And I know a lot of newspapers and other journalistic institutions are struggling. Where do you see the future of music criticism if newspapers are having to cut their budgets so steeply?
Especially being that position kind of falling by the wayside, I'd say.
Yeah. No, it's a little bleak because, you know, of course, there's the internet, there's blogs, there's, you know, a lot of excellent, you know, online arts sites now. But being affiliated with a newspaper or a magazine, you know, gives you certain definite advantages. Editors, a travel budget, a sense of just a kind of a sort of the organizing frame of you know, writing a piece of a certain length, the sort of discipline of you know, fitting what you have to say into, you know, your assigned space for that week, and the readership. I think above all, you know, I just had this great opportunity at the New Yorker of reaching out to people who are leafing through the magazine and like trying to read the magazine from cover to cover, you know, whether or not they're interested in what the art critic has to say, the music critic, and so on. People who subscribe have developed a kind of trust, hopefully, that the magazine will take them to interesting places. And this is a huge opportunity for a classical music writer. So, you know, on the internet, you know, everything gets ghettoized, and it's sort of harder to find that venue where you can, you know, catch readers coming from all directions. So you know, I actually have faith, though, that newspapers and magazines aren't going to go away, and I've never seen this as an either or situation. I've always felt that the internet and all the new media, sort of publication media that have popped up with the internet can exist side by side with the older media, and they can really help each other. So I'm sort of cautiously optimistic on that point.
Yeah.
It's interesting that your sort of career as a critic starts just at the first percolations of the sort of communication technology revolution. So you've been writing and working since, you know, you might have had your first job and not even had an email account, and now, you know, you're on
long
Twitter.
Before,
Yeah.
long before email. But actually, it's funny. I, not through any technological savvy of my own, but just because I knew a few people who were involved in the early stages of the emergence of the internet as a medium for publishing writing. I did have some pieces in Feed, which was the pioneering web magazine starting in 1995, and my friend Stephen Johnson had started that, and I hadn't really even heard of the internet at that point, and you know, had no idea what form it was going to take, but nonetheless, I happened to be a part of that, and then wrote some pieces for Slate when it first started, and then actually I sort of ignored it for a number of years, and then, you know, 2003, 2004, I started noticing this new wave of cultural blogs. Sasha Fear Jones, my pop colleague at the New Yorker, and Terry Teachout, and some other people were obviously having such a good time writing on the internet that I decided to start my own, and it took off from there. Twitter was something I was very reluctant to get involved with.
Well, you talk about
you can't tell. You can't tell now. You don't seem so reluctant today.
I've given in, yeah. But no, at first I was like, ugh, this is where I'm going to draw the line. I'm just not going to get sucked into this.
I think you're the perfect person to follow because you don't inundate us with too much stuff and you don't tweet useless stuff. I probably say that I have more like, oh, that's interesting, I want to check that out clicks from your feed than just about anybody else.
I think you've got to be economical about it because,
sure.
If you tweet too much, people start going away. You just
right.
sort of driven someone over the edge to say, enough of that. And then just not to. I really don't try to say too much. I have links to things, right. And some sort of very quick remark, but I don't believe it's a really sort of valid medium for trying to communicate any kind of thought. But it can take you. It has turned out to be an amazing source of information for me, and sort of following other people's links and just sort of almost instantly becoming aware, when some kind of little scandal is erupting or just
well, it's a way for average people to sort of aggregate sets of interests very quickly, such as the Occupy Wall Street movement. That hashtag is now super busy.
Right.
And if you want to see, I've gotten to the point where I actually finally now use Twitter to find information, where I'm like, I want to find a video of that guy who got hit in the head with a tear gas canister. So I went to Twitter, and there, halfway down the column, there it was.
Sure, yeah. And if you just type in Mahler or some sort of random classical music reference, you should immediately come up with, you sort of find interesting programs that sort of orchestras are doing in different places, and sort of bits and pieces of odd conversations and allusions from unexpected sources, and so it is a pretty amazing cross section of what people are talking about out there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Shall we move on to Frankie J's article?
Hit it, Sam.
Frank J. O'Terry wrote for New Music Blocks this week, Elitism and Its Discontents. I thought it was pretty interesting, but more interesting is when I started digging around in the article. To me, his sort of thesis is that it's the same thing we've talked about on the show a lot. People don't put enough money towards getting actual new music played. Money that's donated to arts organizations goes towards supporting the canon and rich white people. And we've talked about
that last week, that it's not necessarily the rich white people. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I think Alex, in Listen to This, in the preface of the first chapter or something, you say that it's not necessarily even the rich ones. The audience for classical music is not the wealthiest group compared to other arts, and certainly not compared to popular music.
Yeah, the Skybox of the Billy Joel concert, I think.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, or the Yankees. I mean, so you look at the prices for sort of Yankees games. It's all across the board. It's basically more expensive than the equivalent at the Met.
Right.
And yet we're no matter how much we sort of scream and cry about this, we can't seem to get our talking points through, and classical music just continues to be put forward as just sort of the easiest and most obvious example of elite culture, and it sort of drives me crazy sometimes. Particularly when the sort of the giant figures in pop music are making so much more money and are so much more powerful and are allied with entities of great power in the corporate world, in the political world, and yet they always seem to get a free pass and are seen as sort of agents of liberation, and they're sort of against the establishment, and classical music is pretty powerless by comparison. But that said, we also really need to pay attention to where the money is coming from, and Bob Shingleton over at the Overgrown Path blog has been honing in on this and sort of asking about the relationships between certain big European institutions and these banks that have been engaging in rather sketchy behavior. So I think, Frank had a good phrase in his piece about being mindful of all this and mindful of the extent to which classical music is perpetuating that image through its own choices.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, certainly there's more money involved in pop music. That's a given. But I think the point he's getting at is that in classical music, there's not as many people with skin in the game. And the people that do have skin in the game are funding multiple, making sure that Tosca gets performed every year instead of making sure that something new gets performed every year. But that's a problem we've talked about a lot. But within this article, there is reference to the Occupy Museums movement. And he kind of glosses it over very quickly, but I did quite a bit of research and digging around in this. And it's interesting that we're talking about arts and funding, and that article or that reference to Occupy Museum eventually leads to what basically is a funding scenario for an art project. It seems to me they're scheduling these sit-ins at museums to raise awareness of an art project that they're doing that they had a Kickstarter project for. And this person, when you look around, has lots of Kickstarter projects. That seems to be their job as an artist, is to make Kickstarter projects to fund new, different art projects.
Right.
It's not like there wasn't the impetus to start this kind of thing in the first place. I mean, just now there's a name for it. Since Occupy Wall Street came on, we now have Occupy Museum, and it's
I don't know
great, this is actually happening.
I don't know if I'm going to buy in with this person because their official statement reads a little bit more like reads a little too much like artistic apocalypse draws nigh.
Right.
No longer will be the artist, the 99%.
Right. There was one sentence that cracked me up a little bit. Recently, we have witnessed the absolute equation of art with capital. Recently, as opposed to the Renaissance. Hello.
Like in the last couple thousand years.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if
the dinosaurs didn't make that.
Right. I think, well, in music, if you got rid of every canonical work that received funding from a dubious source, you'd be left with Satie, perhaps, and Harry Partch, and
Charles Ives.
A sort of
maybe.
I don't know. I mean, where did he make his money? In the insurance business.
Yeah,
I
guess that's a little sketchy.
Really,
these people are camping out outside the insurance places.
Yeah, how many of those people really needed those sort of high-end insurance policies that Ives devised the hard sell for the agents in the field. So, but I exempt Ives from
yeah, careful how much we talk about this. We might generate an Occupy insurance.
Yeah.
But I thought that this was an interesting article and in the reference to the museum sit-ins because, the Occupy movement has been criticized for not having a message, but it seems to me one of the things they're trying to get at is more direct democratic participation, and when you take that concept and think about it in the arts, they make in their manifesto the point that, there are people in positions to decide what art is worth and what it sells for, and they sort of artificially create these sets of values having to do with this limited number of pieces based on false sense of scarcity. So they're arguing for more direct democratic participation in what we as a culture value as art, and they're figuring out ways like Kickstarter to fund their efforts. And
sure.
I think we should pay attention to this kind of thing because it's only going to get to be more that way. Something like Occupy Wall Street makes people feel like their own individual sense of agency can actually accomplish something rather than
exactly
just sitting doing nothing.
And I want to maybe not equate Frank's opinion here too closely with the Occupy Museum person, which seems to be
he mentioned it
a little
as sort
sketchy.
Of a shoot-off.
Yeah, I mean, I think his real point is that maybe we could be a little bit more aggressive in explaining to people that maybe not every concert needs to have Mozart, Beethoven, or Brahms on it, and there are, people who have been more vocal about that than others, and maybe it's worth us getting together to do something about. I'm not sure his point is necessarily that we should go arm in arm to MoMA with Occupy Museum.
Yeah. Interestingly, they shut down. There were several Washington Post articles about these Occupy museum things, and one of them was they occupied the Air and Space Museum, causing it to be closed. So I'm not really sure what their beef would be with the Air and Space Museum.
Well, that gets into a whole different military-industrial complex kind of issue.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe.
But,
all right.
Well,
Supreme Court.
oh man. So
Apparently.
I read this. I'm still not sure I understand what's going on here. So
yeah, these copyright articles, they often end up hurting my brain.
Yes.
Yeah.
It gets into some very deep ontological issues about what is a work and what is a performance, and
Right.
these people seem to perceive such matters differently than.
Well, why
than
don't
I
we
do.
figure out collectively whether or not we understand what's being said here?
So
Like-
the Supreme Court has decided that playing a work by downloading it or streaming it on the web.
Not the playing, but the downloading of it.
So, but that whole thing is not a public performance.
Right.
They're saying that there's a download, which is a distribution, and then you play it on your machine, and that's just a private performance, which is not something you pay royalties on. Obviously, you don't pay royalties when you put a CD in your CD player and listen to it in the privacy of your own home. And they're saying that downloads and streams from the web are not those.
Right. Who would be the people who would benefit the most if they were to start calling downloads a public performance? That's what I was curious about.
Labels.
Understanding
Well,
the ins and outs of the law, I guess, would
Is
help.
it
with that.
labels or is it like
the label-
ASCAP and BMI?
Well, I mean,
It seems to be coming from the ASCAP direction, and
Yeah.
and, yeah. Like I said, the idea is that composers, songwriters, lyricists, and publishers would have their royalties be juiced up a bit if this rule were put in place. I pay a fee to ASCAP to have stream samples of music still under copyright on my website, and there's a sort of a deal that's been worked out. I assume I would have to pay more if each time you click to listen to one of the little sound files on my site, that's considered a performance. Well, it's not a download. That's
stream.
non-downloadable. So
Yeah, so
different
that's a streaming.
category.
Well, so streaming is just like downloading in little bitty chunks and playing them as you get them. I mean, the
Yeah,
distinction between the two isn't very huge, I don't think. I'm not sure. I think you'd have a hard time making a legal distinction
well,
between
I think-
downloading and
Well,
streaming.
I don't know. A 65-year-old justice and a 25-year-old college student would probably understand what you just said in vastly different ways.
A thing that you
Like
can
if
do.
a justice sits and he clicks on the thing and the music plays while he's staring at his monitor, he's going to think of that as a performance, I think.
Yeah, and a thing that you can do with downloading that you can't do with streaming quite as easily is like burn it to a disk or take it to a different media
Sure.
format, and so that-
Sure.
Yeah.
But you could make
So-
it so that the download can't do any of those things either.
sure.
But the reason why I said labels is, I mean, do you guys think that only royalties would be affected by this sort of thing? I mean, certainly not.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, as far as distribution, I mean, distribution is still really fuzzy with new media downloads and everything.
Right.
Sure, and this is,
like-
I think, like the big problem here, and with
Like
with a
distributors
lot
still
of
get paid, even though like there's, like, go ahead. Yeah.
well, one of the biggest problems with intellectual property law in 2011 and going forward is that it was all obviously written for the most part long before any of this technology existed, and it used to be that if you wanted to give a public performance like a broadcast on the radio, you had to have a lot of money just to technically be able to do that. The logistics of performing a work on television or the radio is very expensive. So they know that if you're able to do this, you have at least a certain amount of money, and you can pay a certain amount to them in royalties. But that's not the case anymore. A couple of schmucks like us with a little bit of computer gear and a little bit of Google search know-how can figure out how to put something like this together for next to nothing, and we don't have the capacity to pay royalties, and most web publishers, I would think, don't have the funds to pay royalties in the amounts that we were talking about for radio and television, and the audience isn't the same size. And I feel like if if content owners would get on board with giving people easy legal means to pay reasonable fees for this, they'd make a lot more money and have to spend a lot less money on lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I think
That sounds like what Lawrence Lessig would think.
Well, we should get Lawrence Lessig on the show.
Hey, all right.
Yeah.
Well, in another article having to do with copyright,
Yeah.
I don't know if I understand this one. Is this bill the
It's the Shostakovich bill.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, this is
So they're trying to make it
Go
so
on
you
V
can
Holder.
Oh, right.
turn back
Right.
copyright onto stuff that has already come out of copyright protection? Is that what?
Well,
the
it's
bill
already
proposes?
happened. This
Okay.
this happened. Shostakovich's music fell out of copyright in the U.S. and
This
then
was like in-
there was a
in-
copyright extension passed in Congress. This has happened more than once, and copyright got longer, and so some of the things that had fallen into the public domain were reclassified as under copyright, and what Maestro Golan is arguing is that once it's public domain, once I've got it, you can't take it away from me. You can't give something to the world and then take it back
Right.
with law.
You've seen everybody who has like their Dover copy of Shostakovich 5. I mean, you can't find those anymore. They don't make them.
Wow.
And that's the reason.
So, go ahead, Sam.
Oh no, I wanted to make sure that I understood what was going on in this article, because I don't really understand what this person is getting at. Like are they saying that there won't be any new scores manufactured if we don't keep the publishing business as is, because they won't be able to pay for people who engrave the music? Because that's just a ridiculous assertion.
It's totally. Well, I think one of my big problems with this, we should say actually, this article was sent to us by Drew McManus of Adaptistration. Thank you, Drew. But one of my big problems with this article is that everybody this guy talked to has a serious financial interest in the way things are right now. And he didn't talk to anybody that has any financial interest in changing things. And I'm not entirely sure that these people are thinking through their own positions very clearly. They talked to a guy in that says any diminishment of copyright protection is going to be bad for the publishing industry. Well, that's stupid. That's stupid.
Well, wait. I mean,
Go ahead.
Let's hear it.
well, this is the second part of a series, I guess.
Yes.
From San Francisco Classical Voice, and the first article
Sure.
gives more the point of view of those who are arguing for, a relaxation or sort of against the specific kind of extension of copyright. So it seems to
That's
be
true.
a kind of a he said, she said series on this question. So I think if you go back and read the previous piece, it's more of a complete
That is true.
picture. But yeah, I mean, I guess I might sort of drift over a little in the direction of the curmudgeon camp on this one, because while I think on the specific issue of this sort of ever lengthening term of copyright, this is doing damage, and we wonder why aren't more 20th century classic 20th century scores played by orchestras and opera houses. One reason is that they're more expensive. Those that are still under copyright, and so audiences, understandably, orchestras with budget issues are staying away from the more expensive repertories. That's an important issue. But all that said, I did agree to some extent with the Bill Holub, the copyist, who seemed to be in general regretting the whittling away at intellectual property values and that causing damage to creative people, and I do sympathize with that to some extent, because I just feel like there's a good sort of compromise position between these extremes, and I don't agree either with those who think what I said. Everything should be free for the taking, and we should sort of do away with the idea of intellectual property altogether, and then there ought to be some sort of sound middle position to be worked out. But that kind of lament, I mean, I guess I do have some sympathy with that.
Sure,
Well,
absolutely, and there's a long way between those two.
Yeah,
and right now we've swung way too far in favor of content owners. There's absolutely no reason that a work should be protected 70 years after its creator dies.
No, it's
I mean,
ridiculous.
if the point of copyright is
Thank
to
you, Disney.
protect creators and encourage
95
them to...
now.
Oh,
really.
95, right. Excuse me. So if the point is to encourage people to create more things and protect their ability to make money on the things that they've created, how is holding on almost a century after the person dies incentivizing them to create more stuff? And even if the copyright term was 50 years, for most of the things that a person would create in their life, they'd be protected until well after they're dead. And
well, we've talked about this.
We assume it's not as though they're just sitting back and collecting royalties for 50 years. During those 50 years, you make another thing.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a problem with one composer, which will remain nameless, but releasing material for free.
Oh yeah.
But it's the idea. No one's really set yet on the idea that you can make money and be successful and everything for giving things away for free. And Jeff Jarvis, who you guys love. I mean, he's a big advocate of that too. But no one's.
Yeah, but he still sells print books.
Yeah, I mean, you can do both.
They're under copyright.
Yeah, but I mean, so does what's the guy's name? Cory Doctorow.
He doesn't. All his works are Creative Commons licensed, and he gives them away for free on his website. You can download them for free, but he still sells hard copies and has been a best-selling author through his hard copies.
Yeah,
I mean, they're not mutually exclusive.
Something I think that's worth mentioning is often the sort of relaxation of copyright camp gets characterized as people who want to do away with copyright.
Right.
And people will associate that movement that doesn't really exist, well, in this context, with Lawrence Lessig, and that is not what Lawrence Lessig says. He's all in favor of intellectual property, and he's all in favor of people making money off of it. He's just in favor of a more, say, I think maybe human scale to the law would be more appropriate. And there's actually a really great video that Dave and I were talking about this morning. CGP Grey has a YouTube site, and we'll put a link to this, and he explains all kinds of different things, like, the history of the Union Jack and, all kinds of different things. But he's got a thing on there called Copyright Forever Less One Day. And if you want to understand the history, like a brief snapshot of the history of copyright and what it was originally intended to accomplish and what it's turned into now, it's a great video. It's like 6 minutes long. We'll have a link to that.
That will be in the show notes for sure.
Right.
Show notes on our site, soundnotion.tv/SN.
Yeah. And it's also interesting how the copyright law impinges upon music versus the way it impinges upon. Oh no,
we got a cat! We got a cat!
Sam, I think you scared it.
My person voice scared her away.
Sorry.
No, that's great.
It's a simple idea.
What's the cat's name?
That was Beatrice.
Beatrice?
Beatrice.
Nice.
Anyway, it's a simple idea that the way music is distributed kind of makes it subject to copyright protection in a far different way. You can't use it at all. So if I wanted to write a paper, I could write a paper and publish it on my personal blog, and I could quote Alex over and over and over and over and over again, as long as I put footnotes in there. I could quote full pages of text and put it in my blog, and that would be legal, and he couldn't, he'd have no legal recourse to sue me for it or anything, as long as I made it clear it was him. But there's no way to facilitate that kind of action with music. I mean, I know it's an obvious thing, but to me, that's one of the people have a natural inclination to want to reach out and grab the things that touch them, like Alex's writing or whatever. but it's just there's no way to accommodate that with music.
Yeah.
And that's a Lawrence Lessig idea as well.
Sam kind of put that one to bed. We're all Sam says this thing. And we're all like,
Hey, can we
All
talk
right.
about this? Can we talk about this South Korean orchestra thing really quick?
hit us.
All right. So, the KBS Symphony Orchestra, an orchestra in Korea, is really upset with their
How
conductor.
upset are they?
They're so upset. No, it's a Korean-American Yale professor is the conductor of this group, and musicians in crucial chairs feel he's so incompetent that they're fed up with him. They're wearing T-shirts to protest his appointment, and it's really turned into something ridiculous.
They say can't tell an oboe from a French horn, that's a tough one. I often.
The problem is that they look so similar.
Yeah, the oboe's with the slide, right?
Right.
But
This guy is at Yale.
Yeah,
He's
this
a
is.
serious
I
guy.
can't believe
Yeah.
that this is true of a person who is a tenured faculty member at Yale.
Although there is a
multiple
person,
competitions.
there's a person who left a comment, Zach Kramer, who claims to have been a graduate student at Yale. We could research that. Who plays with the Royal Flemish Philharmonic, who basically agrees with what the Korean orchestra is saying, that he's a no-talent hack. I would assume Yale wouldn't hire a no-talent hack.
I don't know.
And he got
Hey,
a
I don't know, man.
I've met some pretty dumb people that are never.
That's
you know, I'm not gonna.
Dave's gonna get himself into trouble there.
he got a good review from
Nate,
Steve Smith.
that was an excellent impersonation of me that you just did there.
I'm sorry, Alex, what was that? He got a...
He got a good review from Steve Smith on the New York Times last year. He said they were altogether respectable. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to assume the guy's got his stuff wired pretty tight if he got that job.
What do you
It
think?
seems like the part of the rub might be he's just trying to enforce the rules having to do with how much other stuff the musicians can do, like teaching lessons and taking outside gigs, and he might have maybe overstepped his you know, or might have overdone it in the eyes of the orchestra when he fired some people for that activity.
Yeah, and that had something to do with, you know, the famous story from Brazil.
Oh sure.
With Roberto Minchuk, who was a very tough guy with a very sort of a style that was not at all charming in terms of the way he went about, you know, firing people. But you know, when I was down there earlier this year, I heard some people defending him and saying, well, this, you know, there were a lot of tenured people in that orchestra who didn't deserve to be there. I'm not really taking a position on this. I don't want to be assaulted by
Sure, yeah.
emails
By
and all
tenured
this,
musicians.
but yeah, I mean, it's sometimes it's a question of personal style, and then you sort of pull out the card of, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about musically as a response to that. But it's hard to get at the reality of this situation just on.
It was refreshing to read about some interpersonal drama in an orchestra instead of the same old funding problems.
Oh, sure.
Right, because we've
and-
never read anything about interpersonal drama in an orchestra.
Have you guys all read Mozart in the Jungle by Blair Tyndall?
No.
It's a really good book.
Sex, drugs, and classical music.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a fun read. It's about this oboist, professional
Mozart in the
oboist, just
Jungle.
no longer a professional oboist, and just her exploits in classical music and how different it is from what people, you know, perceive,
Yeah.
and especially with appointments and things like that.
And by the way, file under Lost in Translation, at rallies, musicians have chanted, quote, "We don't want a circus. Make the unskilled conductor step down." I think that probably has a better cadence to it in Korean.
Right.
A very interesting composition contest. I am not a fan of composition contests, generally speaking, but if I were going to say that's a cool contest for composers, the Hilary Hahn thing is a really cool idea. But I'm kind of intimidated now because if you look at the list of people who are already involved, there's some heavy hitters.
Yeah. Yeah.
You just gotta
what
go for it, man.
So Hillary Hahn has a contest, and you can read about it on our website, and we'll have a link to it in the show notes. But if I know there are a lot of, we try not to talk shop too much on the show, but there are a lot of composers, I would imagine, in the audience.
Friend of the show, Do Yoon.
Sure. But you can submit a work to be selected for one of Hillary Hahn's encores for the upcoming season. So you can do that on her site, and she's got a list of, I think, 26 composers that she's already gotten encores from, and she is soliciting submissions for her 27th encore. So if that's something that sounds like that interests any of you, you should check it out.
Accepting submissions until March 15th.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
March 15th.
you got a while to write the piece.
David Diltredigy, Krzysztof Penderecki, Max Richter, Edgar Meyer, Nico Muley, David Lang, Jennifer Hingdon. So there's been some people have gotten performances. Anyway, great contest in my opinion.
Should be fun.
Yeah, I just love the fact that she's taken such a left turn in recent years toward advocating much more strongly for contemporary music and for scores like the Schoenberg Concerto and the Ives sonatas. It's so refreshing to see someone of her stature and sort of automatic mass appeal or what passes from mass appeal in classical music to be making these more daring moves instead of coasting along. And I think it's terrific.
Yeah, well, it's like she built her sort of reputation and notoriety on being a master and doing the workhorses, and like a lot of other people. And now she's sort of got the license to do more of what she wants and take more risk.
Yeah, right. And of course her avant-garde interview with the fish, which you guys saw her interview with the fish? So you should go watch that. That's pretty amazing.
Sweet, we'll check it out.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So she kind of now is getting her street cred, I guess, after playing Bach all those years.
This will be exciting to see what comes of that, for sure.
Yeah. Last thing we want to bring to everyone's attention. Wow, that was weird. Sorry about that. Weird thing just happened. Last thing I want to bring to everyone's attention. Really interesting little tidbit of information from Michael Colgrass's blog. I didn't know, maybe this was out already, but Michael Colgrass's son, who is a filmmaker, is making a documentary about there's a YouTube video about his career, his life and career. So you should definitely check that out if you get a chance. We'll have a link to that here as well.
Yeah, it's a new piece he's writing too, right? It's Arctic
Dreams.
I thought that was an old piece.
Yeah, I think Arctic Dreams is the title of the documentary. I believe that is taken from this old piece, if I understand correctly.
He has a really nice memoir too. It's not really a sort of consecutive account of his life. It's a series of little essays on his encounters with Cage and Stravinsky and various people over the years, and sort of amusing advice for making a living in composition in all its forms. So I'll put in a plug for that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I guess unless anybody has anything else they want to talk about, should we wrap it up?
I think that's it.
Yeah?
We should mention that the pick of the week this week was...
Oh, yes. The pick of the week. For our pick of the week, we're just going to say, instead of listening to a recording this week, go out and pick up Alex Ross's new book in paperback. Listen to this.
We all have our copies.
Also available as an audiobook.
Yes, also available as an audiobook, which Alex himself reads, which is cool. Always love authors reading their own audiobooks. But even if you bought it in hardcover, you should buy the paperback as well, because wait for it.
Smooth.
There is a really excellent edition about John Cage in here that I think is a really touching little tribute to Cage.
Yeah, I was hoping that we would talk about that.
So it's
great.
just a nice little portrait of the person and the musician. So it's worth getting the paperback just for that. I think you can give your hard copy to a friend.
That's very nice of you to say. People to buy multiple copies of my books, but
Well, seriously, any piece of writing that's going to let people have a bigger understanding of Cage. Cage is such a seminal figure in so many ways, but he's sort of trapped in his 433 as far as public notoriety, you know.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to do with this piece, when I wrote about Cage in The Rest Is Noise, I pretty much stopped in 52 with 433 and music of changes and sort of the classic pieces of that period, and I didn't tell the rest of the story, which is so rich and interesting. So I wanted to give
It's
a
just
full picture here.
Yeah, he was world famous as a composer before he did 433, and people tend to think that's why he's famous, and it couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We're all big fans of everything you do, and we're so grateful that you took the time this morning to stop by and talk to us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I love SoundNotion, so everyone
thank you.
should watch SoundNotion even when I'm not on it, especially when I'm not on it.
And stay tuned next week because we'll be having
Alan Pearson.
Alan Pearson,
Maestro
Alarm Will
Pearson will
Sound,
join
and
us.
the Brooklyn Philharmonic.
Yeah, so that'll be fun. Listen, we're just so glad to be joined by Alex Ross. So definitely check out the book. If you haven't read The Rest Is Noise, definitely that is very worthy pursuit. And you should follow him on Twitter, Alex Ross Music, and he writes a great blog at therestisnoise.com. So let's just call it a week. If you have any questions or comments about any of the stories that we talked about this week, you can find links to all of those on our site. You can also leave comments at our site, soundnotion.tv/SN. You can also connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. We're at SoundNotion on Twitter, and you can also get all of us individually on Twitter as well. All our shows, including this one, are available in the iTunes store, so please take a minute to stop over there and subscribe so you can catch every episode. SoundNotion's introduction includes music by Patrick Gulo and video by Tyler Lepp, and this particular episode features a lovely SoundNotion jack-o'-lantern by Miss Karina Van Hamlin.
Yeah.
So we thank her for supporting us that way. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and we will catch you back next week.